Welcome to the class on I think I call this the joys of biblical Hebrew. And it's kind of a list of fun stuff that I just love about knowing a little bit of Hebrew. And I actually started this thing because as I would give talks and even lead services, I would notice interesting things about Hebrew and I would jot them down. And I did that for a couple of years. And actually went through the list with one of my Hebrew professors, and she suggested some other things. And here we are. So I'm going to go to the PowerPoint.
Excuse me, Rabbi Michael. I thought tonight was about Sephardic Hebrew.
Yeah, no, it's about Sephardic. I'm going to have a class next week about Sephardic Judaism.
Oh, that's what I thought it was.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
I
Okay.
thought it was just about Hebrew, not necessarily biblical, but it doesn't matter. I'm interested in
Yes. So I would say it's mostly biblical, but we'll see how it goes. So can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So as always, I have copies of the slides on my website. So again, if you go to the main page on the website and you click on classes and then handouts, lectures and classes, then you can actually find this one in Spanish also, because when I was a year ago when I was in Guatemala, I decided to give this this talk in Spanish, and that was fun.
How do you say Hebrew in Spanish?
Hebreo.
No hablo Yiddish.
Okay, so here we go. Here are things to love about Hebrew. It's the oldest living language, probably some 4,000 years old. It's the only language ever to be brought back into common spoken use. It is, you should pardon the expression, the only language ever to have been resurrected, to mix a few metaphors. And I don't know if I actually talk a lot about that in this discussion, but basically in the mid 1800s, there was a debate about what language to use for the Jewish state in the Holy Land. The Zionism was growing, and some people wanted to use Yiddish, and some people wanted to use German, which was an international language of intelligentsia. Some people wanted to use Russian, and there was one guy who was there's a Hebrew expression called mishugal davar, was nuts about one thing, and the thing he was nuts about was Hebrew. And so he led the charge to make biblical Hebrew the language of the Holy Land. And sure enough, it caught on. And, if you go to Israel today, you'll see 3- and 4-year-olds just jabbering away in Hebrew. It's one of the things I love about Hebrew is it is wonderfully ambiguous. That is, and we'll see this, different words have a huge range of meaning. And it's this is, of course, the reason that one text, namely the Hebrew Bible, can give birth to two religions, both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. And, particularly if you get into the mystical teaching, some would argue that it is the DNA of the universe. So, according to our tradition, God speaks the universe into existence. And, God could have said, gee, it's dark. I am creating light. Or God made light. But that's not the way the text reads. The text reads, and God said, let there be light. So in a sense, Hebrew can be thought of being the DNA of the universe. By the way, as usual, if you have questions or comments, you can just shout in, or if you, it's a little easier for me if you raise your hand electronically. Down at the bottom where you see participants, if you click on that, you will see a little button to raise your hand. So feel free to jump in with questions or comments or your own Hebrew insights. Okay. So our focus is how Hebrew insights open the biblical text and Jewish tradition. And then also how translations miss the richness of the original and may even mislead, and why learning a bit of Hebrew may be worth your time. So Hebrew is written from right to left. What we're actually seeing here is a stone block that was found in Tel Dan, and it's the one It is the only thing in existence that mentions the house of David outside the Bible. So some people speculate that if you're chiseling and you're right-handed, it's easier to chisel this way for exactly the same reason why it's easy to write from left to right, with a pen and ink. And so many ancient languages are written from right to left. Arabic, Babylonian. It's also, as I think many of you know, written without vowels. And one of the things about Hebrew not having vowels means it forces you to read a story. It forces you to read the words in context. If you read them without context, you don't know what they mean. So here's my example. Consider the consonants H and T. If I let you put in any vowels that you want, but just keep those two consonants, you can have hat, hot, hit, hut, heat, hate, and so on. And just by looking at the word, you don't know which one is meant, since you don't have vowels. But presumably in most cases, but as we'll see, not all cases, the context tells you which word should be used. But it makes Hebrew a language of telling stories. And it's not a very precise language. When I say it's wonderfully ambiguous, some of you know I worked for several Israeli companies, and I once met an Israeli attorney, and we were talking about this kind of thing. And he said that in Israel, if they have a very complex document, a legal document, a contract, they cannot write it in Hebrew because it's impossible to be sufficiently precise to write it in Hebrew. Beth, you have your hand up.
I was just wondering if there's any speculation about why there is no vowels, because it makes a difference what word there is.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a great question, and it would be interesting to know if that is typical of very early languages, because you have pictographs where you have a little picture of a dog and hieroglyphics. But yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. Okay, so let's begin with the beginning. So here is the beginning, the opening of the Torah, as you would find it in a Torah scroll. No vowels. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz v'haaretz hayta tohu v'vohu v'hoshech al penei tahom v'ruach Elohim meracheft al penei hamayim. Now I'm just showing off, but I want you to notice that in the Torah text, the bet is written large. We're going to talk about that in a second, and no vowels. So the first letter of the Hebrew Bible is the letter bet. By the way, one of the underlying assumptions of Judaism and of the rabbis is the Torah and the Bible is the source of infinite meaning and has infinite value and infinite depth. So every aspect of the Torah has a meaning. I once described it this way. Imagine you are being separated with the love of your life forever, and you're on the proverbial desert island, and you have one long letter from this person, him or her. How often would you read it? You'd read it over and over again. You would question why certain letters were written big, certain letters were written small. You'd question misspellings. I actually was talking about this with a woman once, and she said, this actually happened to me. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, not that I was on a desert island, but I was going out with a guy, and we had a relationship, and we broke up, and he wrote me a long letter. And in the letter he wrote, handwritten, you are very, and then she couldn't tell because of his handwriting whether he wrote lovely or lonely.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess from the context of the letter, she couldn't be sure, and she didn't have the guts to ask him. But that's Torah. We question everything. So the first thing we're going to question is why the first letter is a bet. Now, if the first letter was another letter, we would question that too. So there's even midrash about the letters arguing and fighting in front of God for the honor of being the first letter. So here's a couple of those insights. One is if you look at the shape of the letter bet, I'm going to back up for a second. You can't go this way. You can't go above. You can't go to the right. You can't go below. You can only go this way. So one mystical insight about the shape of the letter bet is that all knowledge of everything and anything proceeds this way in the Torah. You can't ask what's above the Torah, what's below the Torah, what happened before the Torah, what happened before the beginning. And interestingly, this is also true of cosmology and physics. You can't ask what happened before the Big Bang. You can ask, but it's a meaningless question. In a few weeks, I'm going to have a class on science and religion, and you can ask why that's a meaningless question. Also, the rabbis of the Midrash would say the letter bet is the second letter. It has a numerical value of 2. We're going to talk a little bit about gematria later. And so why begin the Torah with a letter that has a value of 2? And that's to teach us right off the bat that there are 2 Torahs. The first one is the written Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which our tradition teaches God gave to Moses and told Moses to write them down. And the second is the oral Torah, which our tradition teaches that God gave a second revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai with the instructions, never, ever write it down. Okay. We can't simply translate the Bible. Rachel, are you raising a question? A hand to
Yes.
raise?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's an interesting question. Why start the Torah with the letter bet, whereas the Torah starts with a word that happens to start with the letter B?
Yes.
I mean, there could have been a different word to start the Torah. So you'd almost have to say why.
Yes.
You
So
chose
the main point is the underlying assumption is that everything in the Torah has deep meaning, including the letter chosen, the word chosen, and even the shape of the letter. And we'll see some other examples of things like that. Elizabeth, I'm going to mute you because there's a little bit of static coming through. I'm going to try to mute you. It doesn't look like it's working. Okay, it's not working. Okay, so you can't simply translate the Bible. The first 2 words of the Bible present a grammatical problem. The opening phrase of the Bible is Bereshit bara Elohim, which is often translated as in the beginning God created. Sometimes it's translated as in the beginning of God's creation. But if we wanted to say in the beginning God created, we would write Berishonah bara Elohim. Bereshit is half of an expression. For those of you that may have studied Hebrew grammar, it's a smichut. And I can talk more about that, but I think I would interest maybe 1 or 2 of you. According to the rules of Hebrew grammar, after a word like Bereshit, we are required to have the next word be a noun. But the next word of the Bible is not a noun, it's bara. It's a verb, meaning he created. And in fact, as we'll see, it's a verb that's only used with God's creation. Rashi was teaching us, so if I were to try and literally translate the opening phrase of the Torah, I would say, in the beginning of God created the heavens and the earth. So what in the world is going on? You know, sometimes I say, well, maybe God wasn't so good at Hebrew grammar. And I relate to that because I'm not so good at Hebrew grammar. Another possibility is, the rationalist would say, it's a scribal error. Somehow it originally said Berishonah, and scribes made an error, and that error survives. The rabbis would never say, we were talking about this a lot today in my afternoon discussion, the rabbis would never say there's an error in the Torah. So the rabbis would say, and Rashi explains this, God was teaching us that we can't simply translate. Rashi says this phrase screams, I'll use the Hebrew word that Rashi uses, darsheni, drashmi. make up midrashes, dig into the text. Lidrosh, the root word for midrash, means to draw from the text. So Rashi is quoting the midrash, is saying that grammatical error is God's way of saying you can't simply translate, you have to dig in the text. And my contribution to this is God puts the lesson here between word 1 and word 2 of the Torah, so those of us who are a little ADD and have our attention wander won't miss it. It's right up front, you can't miss it. But everybody misses it. In fact, when I love talking to Israelis about this, because they would never question Bereshit bara Elohim. And then when I point out the grammar, they are just shaking their heads and say, you know, I've been speaking Hebrew my entire life, and we never noticed it. Judy, you were...
The only thing that comes to my mind is Reshit Kol means, first of all, in modern Hebrew, and Reshit...
Yeah, so the second word is kol, of all.
Pardon?
The second, the following the word Breshit or Reshit is a noun, all.
Reshit Kol. It almost seems like an adjective, like, first of all...
No, I know that phrase. So I'll give you an example. You know the word Torah.
Yes.
And you know the word Chaim, Torah of truth. So do we say Torah Chaim? We say Torat Chaim, right? Torat Emet. That the hey changes to a taf when it's a feminine noun in this verb form smichut. Sorry for the rest of you who, you know, for whom that was not so interesting. Okay, so to quote Rabbi Jonathan Sachs,
again,
I do it all the time because he's
very quotable.
He's very quotable.
Very quotable.
And he argues that we shouldn't even try to translate. So this I love. I wish I could remember this. I can't quite remember this. He says, every text needs interpretation. Every interpretation needs wisdom. Every wisdom needs careful negotiation between the timeless and the time. This, I think, means it was written, 2,000-3,000 years ago. So there's a meaning that we can apply to our biblical text from that time. But certainly what Rabbi Sachs, who's an Orthodox rabbi, former chief rabbi of Great Britain, he would certainly treat the text as divinely written. And he would say God wrote it at one time, but he wrote it for all time. And this is my favorite line of his: fundamentalism treats the text as if God were as simple as we are. And that is unlikely to be true. So one of the big movements in Protestant Christianity is called in Latin sola scriptura. The Catholic tradition is very much like the Jewish tradition, which says we start with the text. They would, of course, include the New Testament as well as the Hebrew Bible. And we need to have our scholars, and there it's not the rabbis, but the church fathers, interpret the text and help us understand it. One of the elements of the Protestant Revolution or Reformation was, we don't want the church experts to interpret the text for us. Just give us the text, sola scriptura, and we will interpret it. And so certainly Jewish tradition, Catholic tradition would object to that. And I would just say, if you're going to study it, at least study it in the original Hebrew and New Testament in its original Greek. And the Talmud says, one who translates a verse literally is a liar. And I like that because I think it overstates the case, but I would say what it's really saying is one who asserts that this is the only meaning is a liar. And again, I just want to point out, I can only see about 5 or 6 of you. So, and I happen to see some of you raising hands, and I'll call on you, but if not, do it electronically or just speak up. Okay, so now I'm just going to have some fun with some Hebrew words. Creation begins by God separating the waters, mayim, below from the waters above. The Hebrew word for heaven is shamayim. The origin may be the idea that looking up and seeing a blue sky, you might say, there's water up there because it's blue, right? Sham, mayim, shamayim. The word olam is a wonderful word. In
Yeah.
biblical, somebody is chatting. Let's see. Ira, I've been waving my hand. Yeah, I can't see you. Well, Ira, I'm not sure you're even visible, but I don't hear you speaking either. So you may be muted. So if you have a question, you can, and we can't hear you, type it in. Let me see if I can find you here, Ira. Oh, I see you, Ira. I do not see you muted. I see you clapping. That's nice. but yeah, that doesn't show up on my screen. So if you evidently I'm not hearing you, so you can type in a question or a comment. So in biblical Hebrew, olam means by and large. There are some counterexamples here, but by and large it means eternity. So we have the expression which many of you will be familiar with, which is leolam va'ed, forever and ever. In rabbinic Hebrew, olam means the universe. It's space related. And we have in every blessing the phrase Eloheinu melech haolam, God, our God, ruler of the universe. So olam can mean both time and space. And I just love to point out, it took Einstein a few thousand years to come to this same understanding that time and space are really connected. Another one of my favorites, a lot of these are all my favorites, the word Yisrael, the word Israel. Jacob, whose name is Yaakov, gets his name changed from heel, Yaakov, to Yisrael when he wrestles with a being that seems to morph from a person to God to an angel. He's named Heel. It's actually not a wonderful name in Hebrew or in English, and he got this wonderful name because he was a twin and he was holding on to his brother's heel when he was born. The word Yisrael means one who wrestles or struggles or strives with God. So I will often have people come to me and say, you know what, Rabbi, I've got a big problem with God. How could God allow X to happen to Y? I have serious problems. And my response is, welcome to the club. Not only is it okay to wrestle with God in our club, but we actually name our club the God Wrestlers. And it's an interesting contrast with Islam, because Islam means one who submits and surrenders to the will of God. Okay, let's see, there is a chat. So Ira is saying, when you say God created the universe, could it mean that, or should it mean that God created the universe and thereby created our knowledge of God? That certainly is one interpretation. I would say without a physical universe, there would be no beings in the universe, and therefore no one would have knowledge of God except for God. So it's an interesting question. It's almost a Kabbalistic question about why God created the universe. And the answer I like best is that God likes stories. Robin, you're raising your hand.
I have another interpretation when you say heel. To me, when you dig your heels into something, you're tenacious, you stick to it. And my daughter is named for my father, and he was Jacob, and she is Yaakova. She is
nice.
Jacob too.
Okay.
And they were both very stubborn.
Okay. I like it. I like it. But I love the idea that it's okay for us to question and wrestle and struggle with God. Judaism and Islam are actually quite close to each other theologically. This is the biggest difference. You can argue it's one in tone. There are many stories that are in the Bible that are also in the Quran, but you probably know the story of Abraham arguing with God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that story is conspicuously absent from the Quran. And I once discussed this with a knowledgeable Muslim, and for the Muslim, the idea that Abraham would argue with God is beyond the pale. I have a book on my shelf here somewhere called "Arguing with God in Jewish Tradition." It is a significant tradition. Moses argues with God, Abraham argues with God, and they win. You can argue with God, and you just might win. You never know. Okay, Here's a prayer with which you are familiar, the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The interesting thing here is this is just a few possible translations of the prayer, all of which can be encompassed by the Hebrew. Adonai is now our God. Adonai will be one. Adonai is our God. Adonai alone. Adonai, our God. Adonai is one. Adonai is our God, one indivisible Adonai. Adonai, our God, is a unique Adonai. Adonai, our God, is ultimate. Adonai is our God. Adonai is unity or everything. This last line is at the core of Kabbalah. And if you were with me when I discussed Kabbalah, that is really, that interpretation of this phrase is at the heart of Kabbalah, that Adonai is the unity of the universe, and everything is God, and God is in everything. A subject rich with meaning, but beyond the scope of this evening. The word Echad is so rich, I have a book on my bookshelf behind me that is called Echad, The Many Meanings of God as One. So it's 25 essays on the meaning of this one word. And I suppose in theory, we could have 25 essays on every word in the Torah, but I don't have room in my library for that. Okay, there's also some interesting calligraphy in the Shema. So if you look at a Torah scroll or another place where you have the Shema, which would be on a mezuzah, on the scroll that goes in the mezuzah, you should notice that the ayin in the word Shema and the dalid in the word Echad are written larger than the other letters. And there's at least two explanations. Actually, I know some more now since I've been discussing this with people. The word ayin dalid, aid, means witness. So in a way, this prayer can be thought of as being our...
Otherwise, I'll take her, and that's not right.
I'm sorry? Whoops, sounds like someone is there.
I think somebody's...
Okay, let's hope it's... please mute yourself or be aware that we can hear you. So that word ayin dalid can mean witness. The other thing is a large ayin ensures we don't make the mistake of thinking this is the other silent letter in Hebrew, which is an aleph, where shin mem aleph would be actually the Aramaic word shema, which means perhaps. So then we'd read this prayer as perhaps Israel, Adonai is our God. And then the dalid is written large to make sure we don't confuse it with the letter resh, which looks very similar to the dalid, but the resh doesn't. The resh has a curved curvature here. And if we read this as a resh, we would read this as achar, meaning another. So, Hear, O Israel, Adonai our God, there's another God. Another name for God is El Shaddai. It appears 48 times in the Bible. It's often translated as God Almighty, but Shaddai can mean mountain, which is like the God of the mountains. This is the God Almighty idea. But Shaddaiim are also breasts, a woman's breasts in Hebrew. So El Shaddai can mean the God of breasts or a nurturing God in a feminine sense. Another explanation of Shaddai is it can be an acronym for Shomer Daltot Yisrael, the guardian of the doors of Israel. And you will often see a shin on a mezuzah, since you put the mezuzah on the doorposts of Israel. And it also, if that wasn't enough, you take out the sheh and you just look at the Hebrew word dai. The Hebrew word dai means enough. So Shaddai, El Shaddai, is the God that said or made enough, namely the one who set limits in creating the universe. So lots of meanings there. Here's a fun one. In the Garden of Eden, the human characters, are Adam and Chava. We have Chava is related to the word for chai, And it's explained in the text that she's the mother of all living things. So the question is, how did Chava become Eve? And the answer is we have Eve because the Greeks, we're going to talk about the translation of the Torah into Greek, which was a Jewish translation about 200 years before the time of Jesus. And there is no guttural in Greek. They couldn't pronounce the Chava, so they took the coward's way out and just left it off. So Chava became Eva, and Eva in English becomes Eve. For the same reason I just learned this, Avraham becomes Abraham because there's no V in Greek. So they had to decide what to do with the V, the bet or the vet. That's a whole other interesting story, which, the Dagesh and when it becomes. But anyway, that's how Avraham, it's always Avraham in the text. It's never Abraham in the text. And that's how he became Abraham. The role of the woman. The first thing God says is not good in the Bible is loneliness. In the story of the Garden of Eden, God says it's not good for a person to be alone. So God says a man needs an ezer kenegdo, which is often translated as a helpmate, helpmeet, fitting helper, something. And to me, it sounds vaguely demeaning. But in Hebrew, it's not so demeaning because the word ezer is often used for God. In the 90th Psalm, which many of us know as a song, Asa Enai El He Harim, I lift up my eyes to the mountains, Me'ayin Yavo Ezri, where will my help come from? So God is called a help, an ezer, so that can't be demeaning. But to me, the interesting one is the word kenegdo. The word keneged, in its original meaning, has the sense of the scales of balance. So the fundamental meaning of ezer kenegdo can mean the woman being a help by being a balance, a supportive opposite. So in fact, I used this when I wrote my rabbinic thesis at HUC. We write a thesis kind of like a doctoral thesis. And the title of my thesis was Ezer Kenegdo, Toward a Theology of Jewish-Christian Partnership. So this idea of someone being a partner by being in creative and supportive tension, but certainly not by being subservient. Okay, this idea is often used by rabbis under a chuppah in the wedding discussion, but not by me. The Hebrew word for man is ish. The Hebrew word for woman is isha. And in some ways, it's similar to man and woman. It's connected. The Hebrew word for fire is esh, and one of the words for God is Yah, like Eliyahu or Hallelujah. The Talmud teaches us that if a man and woman are meritorious, God dwells within them, ish and isha. But if you take God out, if you take Yah out of the combination of ish and isha, all you have is esh, fire and fire. So if you take God out of the relationship, you are left with fire. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. This is something we discussed a lot recently at Temple of Dad Elohim Torah study in the Garden of Eden. The name of the tree is Eitz Hadat Tov Vera, the tree of knowledge of good, and Ra is often translated as evil. It probably is closer to the idea of just selfishness. The phrase good and evil, on the other hand, is probably a merism. A merism is an English word which means an encompassing phrase, like the phrase soup to nuts. So if I tell you we're having dinner and we're going to have everything from soup to nuts, you would expect more than just a bowl of soup and a dish of nuts. And in other places in the Bible, where this phrase dat tov vera, it's clear that the Bible is talking about knowledge of everything. Another fun thing or issue about the Garden of Eden is that the nature of the fruit of the tree is not stated. The rabbis say it was a fig tree since Adam and Chava covered themselves with fig leaves once they eat of the fruit and they realize they're naked. And so the question is, how did it become an apple? This idea enters through an assonance between the Latin words for wrongdoing, malum, and apple, malus. So this is in a Latin translation. It's called the Vulgate by St. Jerome. So this is a Christian translation. For Christians, the Garden of Eden, as you probably know, is a very fundamental story. It has to do with Satan, has to do with the fall of man. It has great significance, far more significance than in the Hebrew Bible. And so St. Jerome took the opportunity to name the fruit and to name it after a word that sounds like wrongdoing. And so us guys ever since have Adam's apples rather than Adam figs. And let's see, someone I think has a chat. Let's see what it says. I heard people say woman is man plus woe. I like the Hebrew version better. I like the Hebrew version better too. Let's see where we are. The punishments in Eden. This analysis is from Rabbi Harold Kushner. So the consequences of eating the fruit. To the woman, God says, I will make most severe your pangs in childbearing. The word is be'etzev. To the man, God says, by toil, same root, be'etzavon. For those of you who know a little bit about Hebrew, Hebrew is a language with 3-letter roots. So the key letters here are ayin, sadi, bet. And there you see the ayin, sadi, bet. The initial bet is a preposition. And this is kind of an Aramaicism at the end. So what's the meaning of etzev? It can mean pain or toil, but it can also mean grieve. There are actually several other words that specifically refer to pain in childbearing used in other places in the Bible, and they're not used here. So in Genesis 6:6, just before the flood, it says, the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and his heart was saddened. Vayit atzev. So this is loaded with theological insights. And Robin, I will call on you in a second. First theological question or insight is, how can God regret anything? Didn't God know what was going to happen? If God regretted something, then God must have not known. So this is a great proof text that God is not omniscient. And what does it mean that God's heart was saddened? And Rabbi Kushner's interpretation of this is God is grieved in seeing that his creation turns out to be not exactly what he had in mind. And what Rabbi Kushner asserts, and I think with a lot of merit, is that is what God was telling the first couple, to saying, you know what? It just may happen that your offspring may not turn out like what you had in mind. Now, I know it's not true for anybody here, but I have heard that for some people, I don't know who they are, because I've never actually met anyone like this, they actually have children that their offspring aren't exactly like the ones they had in mind when they were making love. So, I'll leave that to you to figure out. I think, Robin, you had something?
Yeah, I believe when we put the egg on the Seder plate, it's called beitzah.
Yes.
And women have eggs that come from their ovaries, which may have a relationship to this in some sort of fashion.
Oh, that's interesting. And in Hebrew, and my modern Hebrew speakers will correct me, the beitzim are referred to testicles. Is that right, Judy?
Beitzim.
Yeah. Eggs. Yeah, I know they're eggs, but I think, just like people will say balls, or I think in Hebrew slang, beitzim refer to testicles. Yes. I don't know if in modern Hebrew, I assume women's eggs would also be called beitzim.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see if let me get back to this. Okay. Here's another fascinating lesson from the smallest letter of the Hebrew Bible, smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet. After Cain murders Abel, you know how Adam and Eve's children turned out, the one brother murders another, probably not exactly what they had in mind. After Cain murders Abel, God famously says to him, "Where's your brother?" He famously asks, "How do I know? Am I my brother's keeper?" And God says to him, and it's always translated this way, "Your brother's blood cries out to me." But the text actually has blood, bloods, plural. If it were singular, it would be dam achicha, but the text has dame achicha with the addition of that little yud. So again, the rabbis are going to have to say, it's, maybe it was just a drip of ink. The rabbis are going to have to struggle with this, and they're going to come to the conclusion that there's a lesson in this. It's not a typo. And the understanding is what is crying out to God is that all the children that will never issue from Abel, a quarter of humanity has been destroyed, and their blood is crying out to God. So from this, the Talmud teaches that whoever destroys a soul is considered as if he destroyed an entire world, and whoever saves a life, it is considered as if he had saved an entire world. And for those of you who may recall, at the end of the movie Schindler's List, you have the survivors, not only Schindler's Jews, but their children and grandchildren are walking past his grave and putting stones on his grave. And this quote from the Talmud is in there. And for me, also very interestingly, this teaching is also in the Quran. Okay, here is another important one. On the subject of homosexuality, it says, the Torah says, "Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. It is an abomination," or it is an abomination, toeva. So there's a question we're not going to address here. What does it mean for a man lying with a man as with a woman? We actually discussed that when we had a discussion on personal morality. But the question is, what does toeva mean? Always translated as an abomination or something similar. If you look in the Torah where the word toeva is used, it's used quite often. I think with one single exception, it's used to proscribe, to forbid Canaanite or other idolatrous practices. So for the kosher laws, there's a prohibition against marrying your ex-wife. If you have a divorce and your wife has been with another man, you're forbidden from marrying her. There's a prohibition against a woman wearing man's clothing, like pants or slacks. And there's also the practices of other nations, consulting spirits, worshiping other gods. Even the Egyptians describe eating with non-Egyptians as toeva, and sacrifices and offerings without ethical behavior. So I think from a Reform perspective, we would argue that toeva is as bad as a woman wearing slacks. Namely, it is a ritual prohibition and not an ethical prohibition. So while there's a lot of range among Reform rabbis about different aspects of keeping kosher and observing the Sabbath and so on, I don't know any Reform rabbis who will not participate in marriages between same genders. Another one, rachamim, rachmonas in Yiddish. The word rachamim means compassion or tender mercy. The root of the word rachamim is the word rechem, meaning womb or uterus. Thus, the Hebrew mind associated uterus with loving compassion. Contrast this with the Greek word for uterus, hystera or hysterica, which becomes, in the Western mind, associated with hysteria. And it's actually the same thing in Arabic. I've had this discussion with Muslims, and they are, I think, surprised and delighted because Erakum is an Arabic phrase meaning God all merciful, very common in Arabic lexicon. Okay, one or two more, and then I'll open the table for a little bit of discussion, and then there's more. Even the shapes of letters, another word on the shapes of letters is significant. So consider the Hebrew word for truth, emet. Look how balanced they are. The aleph is standing firm on two feet there. The mem has a good solid base, and the taf also 2 feet, very similar to the aleph. Also, aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Taf is the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Mem is the middle letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Truth is incredibly stable and well balanced. Now let's look at the Hebrew word for lie, sheker. Now I will admit I chose a font where this is particularly true, but shin is wobbling around on a curved base and is off balance. Sheker looks like a ballerina who's about to fall on her face, up on point with the weight over here. Resh has the same problem in the other direction. And shin, kaf, and resh are the 3 next to last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So truth is incredibly balanced even in the Hebrew font, as is sheker equally unbalanced in Hebrew font. Let me pause for just a second and stop sharing and just ask if there's any questions, comments. I've been kind of jabbering on, and I may not have been able to see people raising hands. So I would just pause, take a drink of water, and anybody have anything, or else I will jump back in.
I do have a comment,
Yes.
but it's hard for me to explain unless you have the Chumash. Do you have the art scroll there, the stone edition?
Yes. Hold on.
You do.
Hold on.
Oh yeah, that's my book. That's
Okay.
okay. Page 126.
126. Okay. Yeah. Whoops, Elizabeth, are you there? You seem like you're frozen, and I don't know what happened to you. My guess is you should probably logging out and logging back in if you don't.
Trying to say something, I think.
Try unmuting. Okay, your image is frozen. That's often a connectivity issue. If you blank out your camera, we probably will be able to hear you. So I think I'm going to go on, but I have that page open, or no, she's gone out. Anybody else have any questions?
Hello.
Okay,
question
you're
about
back.
Hebrew.
Okay. Yep, page 126.
Yes.
Okay.
The top line where Rebecca finds out she has twins.
I can't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, Meha. The first line
Yes.
where it says Yameh, I don't pronounce well.
V'imalo yameha laledet. Yeah.
Right. The first word has 2 yuds. Now she has. This is what she's saying. There are twins in her womb. The second word has 2 lameds. The third has 2 he.
Hayes, yeah.
The next one is a double tuf.
Double mem.
And the next word is a double
mem. Yep.
Well, 1, 2, 3. You have 5 words with doubles, with twins. Each word has a
very
twin
cool.
in it.
Very cool. Yeah. So what you're pointing out is in the text where
twin.
Yeah, in the text where you're going to have Jacob and Esau, in that verse, every word has a double letter. So again, that would be something that I might not notice, but no doubt the rabbis would notice. And I love it.
One rabbi in Israel.
Yeah.
One rabbi in Israel.
So that's a perfect example of as you dig more and more into the text, you can find, you could call it hidden meanings, or just more proof that the text is deeper than it appears on the surface. And the other point, which I think is an important one, is you would never get that if you're reading the English. You have to read it in Hebrew to get those kinds of insights. Okay, any other questions, comments?
Sorry, I just have to say Lila Tov to everyone. I have to sign off now. but-
Okay, take care. This will be
Lila
recorded,
Tov.
so if you want to watch the, in a day or two, it will be on my website.
Thank
I just wanted to ask, are
Yes.
there capital
No,
letters in?
there's no. There's
So
no.
if you have somebody's name and you're reading the line in Hebrew, you just have to know that that's a name. There's like no signal that it's a proper noun.
Yeah, there's no
or-
uppercase, there's no lowercase, there is no punctuation. So, for example, we have in the story of the Garden of Eden, Adam. And I would say the most common interpretation is Adam means humanity. And then once, I don't remember exactly where in the story, it becomes the man's proper name. And one way there's a clue, I think at some places, it's referred to as Ha-Adam, the human. You wouldn't say Michael, or so you have to dig into the text, but that also makes the text ambiguous. Are we proper names? When they talk about him, in an English text, if they're talking about God, the H would be capitalized, and we'll actually see that in one example. If it's in Hebrew, him, it would just be lo, or even just a vav, and we don't know if they're talking about a person or God. So it adds to the ambiguity.
Does that mean that when you play Scrabble in Hebrew, that all words are allowed, even names?
I have no idea. I actually do have a Scrabble set in Hebrew. You'd be amazed how few people want to play Scrabble with me in Hebrew.
Yeah, that's why I sold mine. I can't do it.
So the question is, could you use a word like Adam, Aleph, Daled, Mem? I actually don't know if in Scrabble you have final mems or you can just use the regular mem. That's another interesting question. You could probably use Adam and claim it means human rather than a proper name. And by the way, the reason for final form letters is in very ancient texts, they didn't leave much space or any space between words. So occasionally it's nice to have a letter that ends a word to help you get your bearings. I once discovered this. I'm trying to see if any of my buddies from Ojai are here. I don't see them. Oh yeah, Rachel's there. I was once reading, in Ojai, we have a Torah scroll that's over 300 years old. And it's a Sephardic scroll and it's beautiful. It feels like velvet. And one time I was reading it, and I always prepare for the reading, but I prepare from a book. And I'm reading it and I realize I'm having some trouble reading this. And I noticed there's no space between the words. Because I had prepared so well, I could still read it. But, in some places there's a little bit of space, but by and large, there's no space between the words. So having a final form letter actually is very helpful.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
For instance, at the end of the word, sometimes if you read the Torah itself, for instance, the resh is completely extended.
Okay, so that's a question of calligraphy, because in a Torah scroll, they like to make right hand and left hand justified so that, it looks like a column.
Yes.
And if the guy hasn't prepared very well, he's written a bunch of letters, now he just has a resh and he's got a lot of space to fill, he will draw it large to fill.
Yes.
There's actually tools that sofers have to prevent that problem from happening. Okay, let me jump back into the text.
I have a question first.
Okay, go ahead.
Not a question, but a comment about names in Hebrew. But it's just like when you think about it in English, for instance, the name Gene, G-E-N-E, a man's name, it also means a gene.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
So my guess is the rules say you can't use a name if it's only a name, but if it's another word as well, then you're welcome to use it.
Yeah, and again, I have no idea what the rules of Hebrew Scrabble are.
Yeah, because when you look at it too in German, all nouns start with a capital letter.
Oh, that's
so
interesting.
So that's what. Well, when you think about the Scrabble letters in English, they're all capitals. There aren't capitals and small letters.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, believe it or not, that question has never come up before.
I believe it. That's
So-
true for a lot of
so-
questions I asked.
So Yasha Koch. Okay, so killing or murder. In the commandment about taking a human life, the Hebrew is clear, lo tirtzach, thou shalt not murder. What's the difference between murder and killing? Murder is taking the life of an innocent person. Killing is taking any life. We kill germs when we brush our teeth. That's killing. We kill those harmless, precious little bacteria. So why does the King James translation into English, which by the way is the first translation into English, and before this time, one of the innovations of Protestant Christianity was to allow translations. Until the time of King James, having a English translation of the Bible was a capital crime punishable by death. So in the King James translation, it reads, thou shalt not kill. And some scholars believe that in the time of King James, the word kill meant what we mean by murder, and the English word slay meant what we mean by kill. So this translation, thou shalt not kill, was correct in the time of King James. It was a correct translation, but English usage has changed, resulting in, in generations of pacifists that argue that the Bible says you should not kill. Okay, another one of my favorites. The Hebrew word for angel is malach, and the Hebrew word for messenger is malach. Judaism teaches that God sends us into the world to perfect creation, to complete creation, l'taken olam, to practice tikkun olam. Are we simple messengers or divine angels? Speaking Hebrew, there is no difference. Very important in discussions with Christians in particular, the meaning of the word Messiah. In some ways, the issue between Judaism and Christianity is not so much who is the Messiah or whether Jesus was the Messiah, but the real issue is what do we mean by the word Messiah? The English word Messiah is a translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach.
Yeah.
Mashiach means anointed. The kings of Israel were anointed by pouring holy oil on their head, either by prophets or by priests. When the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek, about 200 years before the time of Jesus, it's a Jewish translation. They had to pick a word for Mashiach, and the word in Greek is Christos, which, by the way, begins with the Greek letter chi, which is why we have Xmas. Chi looks like an X. The Greek Christos gives rise to the English word Christ. So this is why when I talk about Jesus, and particularly in my interfaith work, I have lots of discussions about Jesus. I never refer to Jesus as Christ, because if I were or use Christ as Jesus' second name or family name, to do so is to acknowledge that Jesus is the Messiah. And of course, in Judaism, we don't acknowledge Jesus as Messiah. So I recommend to you, unless you're making a theological point, when you talk about Jesus, do not refer to Jesus as Christ. Hallelujah, an entire Hebrew sentence in one word. Hallel means praise. The vav on the end of Hallel makes the verb into the second person plural imperative, or y'all praise, you plural praise. As we saw before, Yah is one of the words for God. So hallelujah means praise God. This is something I always mention with Christians who claim they don't know any Hebrew at all. Here's something really powerful and an ambiguity in Hebrew, and very powerful in my own life. It took only 2 years, not 40, for the Israelites to go from Egypt to the Promised Land. As they get to the borders of the Promised Land, Moses sends spies from the leaders of the tribes, and the spies report that the land is great and terrific and flowing with milk and honey and huge bunches of grapes and everything, but they say, we cannot attack that people, for the people is stronger than mem, nun, vav. So the usual translation is that people is stronger than mimenu. The word nu, the suffix nu means us, like we say Avinu, Malkeinu, Eloheinu, and so on. So the usual translation is it's stronger than us. But the rabbis also point out, since there's no dots in the Torah, the question is the dot here or is the dot above the vav? If the dot is above the vav, then it would be mimeno, and meaning it's stronger than him, presumably with a capital H. And I once heard a darshanit, a woman scholar, talk about this parsha and ask the question, how many of us spend our lives at the end of our own promised land because we believe our problems and the difficulties in getting to where we want to go are stronger than us or stronger than God. And it's just where you put that dot. And I would argue that the Hebrew encompasses both ideas. The people were afraid that the native Canaanites were stronger than us and also stronger than God. Does Moses have horns? So here's I always like to ask this question, and I will glance at you for a moment. Oh, I can't. It's weird. I can't see you so well. There's something going on crazy with my Zoom. How many of you have had the experience of someone asking to see your horns if you're Jewish? Anybody? Or just me? Lois, yeah? Yeah, and Beth also. Yeah, and it wasn't in a mean way. I mean, it was a sincere question. People had thought Jews had horns. So where does this particularly crazy idea arise? And it's not only your average run-of-the-mill people, but Michelangelo in the statue of Moses, there's clearly horns there. So again, it's in the Hebrew. In Exodus, speaking of the change in Moses, in Sinai, the usual translation with the vowels is karan or panav bedibro ito. That karan would be rays of light from his head, from Moses speaking with God. But I'm sorry?
Talking to a cat.
Oh, okay. But the Torah has no vowels. Let me know if the cat answers. The Torah has no vowels. So the question is this word karan means to shine, that light shine, beams of light, or keren, horn. So again, Jerome, Christian translator, translating into Latin, I'm not going to try and read the Latin, but the translation says his face was horned from the conversation with the Lord. And of course, the Jewish translation is his face was radiant. So here's one example where theoretically you could have either interpretation.
Is Karen the same root as the Quran, or is that a different?
No, the Quran is from the root kara, which means to proclaim or call out.
Thank you.
But Karen HaYesod, I think, it's the name for the Jewish Federation or some Jewish organization. It's like the Horn of Plenty.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So people often ask me, how can you read Hebrew without vowels? So anybody want to take a shot at this one?
I will.
Go ahead.
Many people think it's impossible to read English without vowels, but if you know the language and the context of the sentence, it's not hard at all.
Very good. And this one is just a fun example. So it turns out if you know the language, it's not so hard. We were talking about this today also in my little afternoon discussion. If you're just taught how to read or decode Hebrew without knowing the meaning, it's impossible. You have to memorize. Most kids memorize their Torah portion. But if you know the context, and if it's not, reading Torah is not very difficult, except poetic sections of Torah can be difficult. And obviously, if there's a lot of words, when I read Torah, if I'm reading not a simple narrative, but a section where there's a lot of unique words, like if they're sacrificing animals and things, and I don't know those words, that takes a little more preparation. This is something I talk about at every funeral. In the 23rd Psalm, the one that begins, "The Lord is my shepherd," it says, goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And the word for follow is yirdafuni. It's from the verb lirdof, which means to pursue. So I always comment that goodness and mercy are actually chasing us, but sometimes we just have to slow down a bit and let them catch up. Okay, I will pause a second. Anybody have any questions, comments? We're going to talk a little bit about gematria and why a talus is tied the way a talus is tied. Okay, here we go. So the idea of gematria is another layer of meaning in the Torah. So not only do the words have meaning, but because kind of like Roman numerals, the letters have numerical value, so we can get interesting things coming out of the numerical value of the letters. So in the simplest gematria system, the first 10 letters have values 1 to 10. The 11th letter has value 20 up until kaf for 100, and then 200, 300, and 400, making it difficult to have big numbers in Hebrew. And if you think that's difficult, try multiplying in Hebrew or try multiplying in Roman numerals. But the one that we're all familiar with is chai. Chet is 8, yud is 10. So the word chai means life. So in the Ashkenazi tradition, we often give in multiples of 18 representing life. By the way, in the Sephardic tradition, we'll talk about it next week, the key number is 5 for the chamsa, the hand of God. Excuse me. So we have this very odd thing that we're all familiar with called the talit. And the tzitzit, the fringes of the talit, are tied in a very specific way. We have a double knot, we have 7 coils, we have a double knot, we have 8 coils, we have a double knot, we have 11 coils, we have a double knot, we have 13 coils, and then we have a double knot, and there's 8 threads and 4 corners. Everybody with me so far?
Yes.
Okay. So why? So if I take the gematria of the word tzitzit, I have tzadi, yud, and taf. There are the values, adds up to 600. There are 5 knots in each tzitzit, and there are 8 strings in each tzitzit. If I add them up, I get the 613 mitzvot. And the Torah teaches us that when we look at the tzitzit, we should remember the commandments. So that's the key. But wait, there's more. If you order before midnight and send in $19.95, I will teach you the following additional insight without extra shipping costs. The first group of windings is 7, the number of days of creation. The second group is 8, the number of days until circumcision, Brit Milah. The sum of the first 2 groups is 15, which is the gematria of the first 2 letters of God's actual name. We're going to talk more about God's actual name. Yud is 10, Hey is 5. The third group is 11. The last 2 letters of God's actual name, Vav is 6, Hey is 5. The fourth group is 13, the gematria of Echad. So the total number of windings is the phrase Adonai Echad, which, as I mentioned before, is the central observance or the central element of Kabbalah, as I understand it. And you can also look at the word Echad. The Aleph is 1 talit. The Chet is 8 strings of the tzitzit. The Dalet is 4, the 4 corners of the talit. I'm going to go back, and somebody had maybe not a question, but somebody chatted a question. Yeah, you can save money by donating by becoming Sephardic, but you might be asked to donate $500. The safe thing is 90, 5 times 18. Good observation. And you know, Sonia, my wife, who's Sephardic, never heard of the tradition of 18 as a donation. In the Sephardi world, it's always 5s, and they're always looking for 5s. Okay, this I think is also very, very powerful. The Hebrew word Torah is derived from a root, yareh, which means in archery to shoot an arrow to hit a mark. And by the way, chet, a common word for sin, means to miss the mark. The word for teacher, moreh or morah, male and female, derives from the same root. The word Torah is understood in Hebrew and in Torah and in Bible to be meant broadly as an instruction applied to all Jewish teaching. So it can mean the Torah scroll, the first 5 books of the Bible, the entire Bible, all of Jewish sacred literature, or any teaching. Tonight, I'm giving you my Torah on the Hebrew language. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek by Jews, a translation known as the Septuagint, they had to come up with a word in Greek for Torah. And the word they chose was nomos. But the Greek word nomos has a meaning of law, translation into the word law, in a very narrow sense, as in the code of law. Thus, the Jews reading their Torah in Greek had the sense that all of the laws were strictly binding, and we had to comply with them all. And if we failed on one of them, we were in a bad relationship with God. This led the early Christians who were Jews to see the law and the Torah as an impossible standard or even a curse, making other paths to God necessary. So quoting from Paul in some of his letters, he says, those who rely on the keeping of the law, nomos, Torah, are under a curse. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. We conclude that a man is put right with God only through faith and not by doing what the law commands. But Judaism never held that one must obey each and every law or somehow be estranged from God. So I think in no small part, and this is a concept I've reviewed with many Christians, I would say in no small part, one of the reasons for the origin of Christianity is a problem that arises in Greek, in the Greek translation of the Torah, which is a Jewish translation. I want to emphasize that, which is not a problem in the original Hebrew. So you can get a sense of how important translation is. God's actual name, like Mike or Sam or Evelyn, is Yud He Vav He. The name is so sacred that we are never to say it. In fact, we're not certain how it is vocalized or pronounced. The last time it was said by the high priest in the Holy of Holies in the temple on Yom Kippur. The holiest person, the high priest, in the holiest place, the Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant, in the temple on the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur. These days, we don't even say the word when we're praying or reading from the Torah scroll. Rather, we say, as you know, the Hebrew word Adonai, which means my Lord. The name is so sacred so that for the number 15, we don't use what you would expect, Yud and He, 10 plus 5, but Tet and Vav, because Yud and He would be Yah, which would be one of God's names. So we use Tet and Vav, which we would read as 2. This is why the holiday of the 15th of Shvat is Tu B'Shvat rather than Yah B'Shvat. Adonai is a word that we say when we come to Yud He Vav He in text or prayer. It literally means my Lord. In fact, to make it more interesting and problematic, it's actually in the plural. Adonai means my Lord's plural. Adoni would mean my Lord. The word is so sacred that traditional Jews only say Adonai when praying or reading from the Bible, sacred text. Otherwise, they would say Hashem, the name. As a reminder not to try to pronounce Yud He Vav He when reading the Bible, the people that added the vowels, they put the vowels for Adonai under Yud He Vav He. If you try and pronounce this word as written, you get Yehovah, which from where we get the word Jehovah. So we don't know how to pronounce Yud He Vav He, but we know it's not Jehovah, and the people who refer to God as Jehovah never got the memo. But to their credit, Jehovah's Witnesses know this, and I have discussed it with them. One of the things which is kind of funny is when the Jehovah's Witnesses call on my house, they regret it, because I invite them in, we start reading the Bible, we'll discuss theology. Meanwhile, they have 14 more blocks to cover before the end of the day. And so that's my very subtle revenge. In translation, when the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek, the Septuagint, the name is translated as Kyrios, or Lord. In the Latin translation, it's rendered Dominus, meaning master or owner, which was the title given to the Roman emperors, which makes sense, from 4th century Latin. So this is how we get the sense of calling God Lord. When we come to Yud He Vav He in English translation, it's almost always translated as Lord, and this is where that translation comes from. What's the actual meaning of Yud He Vav He? Of course, only God knows. It has no vowels, and some of my teachers say this. I will confess I don't entirely understand it. They say it's no real consonants. They say all the letters are blowing sound, rushes of air through the mouth. The Hebrew root is He Vav He, which is the root which has a meaning of being or existence. The Yud at the beginning, before the He Vav He, signifies the imperfect tense, which is that which is or that which will be. And Rabbi Arthur Green, who is a mystic, suggests that the name may be a conflation of all of the tenses of the verb to be. Wow. So it ought to be translated as was, is, or will be, or just being. The Hebrew word for existence is Havayah, which is just a rearrangement of God's name. If some scholars are correct in thinking the correct pronunciation of the name is Yahweh, then the verb may be in the Hefil, causative form, meaning the one or he who will cause being or existence. And I personally think that's a great name for God. You may not know it, but abracadabra is Aramaic. You can see the root bara. The second word of the Bible is bara. The aleph in front is the first person future. I will create. But this verb create is only used by God in God's creation. Ke, which means like. Davra, daber, is to speak. The aleph at the end is Aramaic. So it can mean I create as I speak. And I once gave this lecture, I think, to a bunch of Christians. And somebody suggested, and I thought it was a great idea, maybe this is what God said just before speaking the Torah. Abracadabra, I will create as I speak. If you're interested, there are lots of good sources to learn Hebrew. My favorite one actually is this one, Prayer Book Hebrew, the Easy Way. The nice thing about the prayer book is it has a limited vocabulary. And it's actually, the rabbis intended the prayer book to be simple so anyone can pray. I didn't believe it either, but now that I've been through this for a few years, the Hebrew of the prayer book and the blessings is much simpler than the Hebrew of the Bible. Some bottom lines. There's an old Italian saying, which translated reads, to translate is to betray. Maybe that's a little strong, but it does highlight how understanding Hebrew reveals some of the wonder of the Hebrew Bible. I hope these thoughts will inspire you to pursue your interest in learning in Hebrew. And coming up, next week, I'm going to be talking about Sephardic Jewry. And then I haven't taught this one online yet. I've taught it in a number of settings. So I'm hoping that some of you who only know me through these Zoom meetings might want to attend. I think, as many of you know, I was a physicist before becoming a rabbi. So there is a lot to be said about the intersection of the worlds of science and religion. So I will touch in 3 sessions, so in some detail, on everything from quantum mechanics to Kabbalah, to revelation, to relativity, and Einstein to Rashi. Evidence for God's existence, scientific evidence for the existence of God, the truth of the Bible, and discuss the question, which I have discussed in other settings, how a good and loving God can allow evil and tragedy in the world. So I hope to see you then. And then my plan is, after that, to actually teach an introduction to Judaism class. There are a number of people who have expressed an interest in learning more about Judaism just generally, Jews and non-Jews, and some about conversion. So that's my plan, and I will be announcing more details on that. And as many of you know, I'm in my office every day from 4 to 5, sitting in front of this screen, wearing out my tuchus. So that's the class. Any questions or discussion? Well, I catch my breath. I realize I was going. Yes, Lois.
So if you have a Hebrew word and then you have different vowels or vowel sounds, so you can have the same root letters or letters, but can you change the vowels and then have a different word, which I guess you can. But really what I want to know is there an app where you can use like a dictionary? Because if you just put in the letters, I've put in letters, but if you can't put the vowels in, it's hard to get a definition that makes sense sometimes.
Yeah, so there are lots of apps, and I have lots of dictionaries. And I think in general, how these apps work is, it'd be interesting to try it. So if you put in Kuf Resh Nun, would it come up with both horn and beam?
Because
well,
a little keyboard pops out, right?
Yeah,
So
yes.
Very little.
Let's see. Well, actually, you have to have the keyboard loaded. So let me try it. Kuf, Resh, and final nun. Oh, that's interesting. So the translation here is foundation, which is, it's modern Hebrew. So like the Jewish Foundation, the Jewish National Fund. So this is.
So you need an app for biblical.
Okay.
Hebrew.
So now alternative translations: fund, principal, corner, beam, horn. So in the alternative translations are the horns, and I'm just trying to see. My vision isn't. Yeah. So in the alternative translations, they will put vowels in.
So which app are you using? Do you recommend one?
It's Google Translate. Google Translate is astoundingly amazing. Let me just do
download that, or
yes,
you just go on
yes. I mean, it's free. It's Google. I'm just going to give a little mini commercial for Google Translate. You can actually hold it over I did this when I was in Guatemala. You hold it over a menu, which is in Spanish, and on your screen, it's in English.
Wow.
Wow is right. I did a tour of the National Palace in Guatemala City, and the guy who was giving the tour could only speak a little bit of English. And I tried to with my Spanish, but it wasn't great. But occasionally we would get stuck. I would take this app out, and there is a chat version where you can hold it up between you two, and he sees, I speak in English, he sees it upside down for me, right side up for him in Spanish. He speaks in Spanish, I see it in English. You can also have it read to you if you're wearing, either from the microphone. Anyway, it's a great app.
So it can read Hebrew too?
I don't recall it either. I can't remember whether it reads Hebrew or writes Hebrew. It doesn't go both ways. I think it does not read Hebrew, but I think you can actually set it over.
So I Google Translate, and then it'll tell me, or it's in the Play Store.
Yeah, it's in the Play Store. Just download it. And there's lots of other apps. I think I have another app called Hebrew.
I have a few, but they're very frustrating.
Yes, well, should be your worst problem. I have another one called Hebrew Translate.
What's the struggle?
Yes, Yisrael. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Yeah, go ahead.
I had one comment about translating, although it's not translating Hebrew, it's translating Yiddish, which uses a Hebrew alphabet, but doesn't use vowels. So I don't have.
Except in a few places, they will have a vowel, like the comets for Aleph.
Yeah, well, they use the letters as vowels. So the Yud is always E, and the Ayin is always S. So,
Okay.
So it's like that. But so I was trying to find this song that my mom learned when she went to camp. And, it was part Yiddish and a lot of English in it. And the two big words that are in English are mosquito and tent. But the rest of it's in Yiddish, but I was writing it in English characters because couldn't find a
Mhm.
Hebrew keyboard. And I got a whole page about how to put up mosquito netting, and it's all written in German.
Oh, that's very funny. And by the way, as you probably know, in Israel, if you buy a newspaper, there are no vowels.
Really?
Children's books will have vowels as they're learning to read. And the other area where there are always vowels are books of poetry, because there, as you can imagine, a poet may use very creative uses of the language, and it's very important to be precise. So even in Israel, if you buy a book of poetry, you will always have vowels in there. And it's a whole other interesting discussion, which I won't go into, is how vowels entered the tradition. And so there's, it's never ending. I can never get myself to stop. So thank you for your patience of hanging on to the bitter end. Next week,
Thank you.
Sephardic Jewry. Take
Bye.
care.